The rain hammered against the windows of the penthouse as Daniel stood alone on the balcony, watching the city lights blur through the downpour. Below him, Manhattan stretched out like a glittering carpet of wealth and ambition, but up here, 50 stories above the streets, he felt nothing but emptiness. Behind him, the party raged on. Champagne glasses clinked, laughter echoed through marble hallways, and men in tailored suits discussed stock portfolios and offshore accounts. This was his world. This was supposed to be his future. Daniel turned away from the view and walked back inside, navigating through clusters of guests who barely noticed him. They knew his name, knew his father's empire, but none of them truly saw him. He was 24 years old and felt like a ghost in his own life. His father, Richard Blackwood, stood near the grand piano, holding court with a group of investors. Even from across the room, Daniel could feel the weight of expectation pressing down on his shoulders. Graduate from Harvard, join the company, marry the right woman, continue the legacy. It was all mapped out, every step predetermined like a chess game he never asked to play. He slipped out through a side door, grabbed his coat, and left the building without telling anyone. The doorman barely looked up as Daniel walked into the rain. He needed air. He needed silence. He needed to feel something real for once in his carefully constructed existence. His driver called after him, but Daniel waved him off and kept walking, letting the rain soak through his expensive suit. The streets were nearly empty at this hour. Most people had the sense to stay indoors during a storm like this, but Daniel welcomed it. The cold rain felt honest in a way nothing else in his life did. He walked for blocks without direction, past closed shops and darkened restaurants, until he found himself in a quieter part of the city, where the buildings were older and the streets less polished. His shoes, handmade Italian leather, were ruined, but he didn't care. He turned a corner and saw a small cafe with its lights off and metal shutters pulled down. On the steps leading up to the entrance, partially sheltered by a narrow overhang, someone huddled beneath a tattered blanket. Daniel slowed his pace. He had seen homeless people before, of course. The city was full of them. But something made him stop this time. Maybe it was the way the figure seemed so small against the vastness of the storm. Or maybe it was his own desperate need to connect with something beyond the hollow luxury he'd left behind. He approached slowly, not wanting to startle whoever was there. As he got closer, he realized it was a young woman, maybe his age or younger, curled up against the cold with her arms wrapped around herself. Her hair was damp and tangled, her clothes worn thin and clearly inadequate for the weather. But when she looked up at the sound of his footsteps, Daniel froze. Her eyes were the most striking thing he had ever seen, not because they were beautiful in a conventional sense, but because they held something raw and unguarded. Pain, yes, but also a fierce kind of strength that took his breath away. She didn't speak, just watched him with a mixture of wariness and exhaustion. Daniel didn't know what to say. Every word that came to mind felt inadequate or patronizing. Finally, he managed, "Are you okay?" It was a stupid question. She was obviously not okay. She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders and looked away. "I'm fine, just waiting for the rain to stop." Her voice was quiet but clear, and there was a dignity in it that surprised him. Daniel glanced up and down the empty street, then back at her. "There's a diner about 2 blocks from here. It should still be open. Can I buy you something warm? Coffee, food, whatever you need?" She looked at him suspiciously. "Why would you do that?" Daniel didn't have a good answer. "Because it's cold and you're soaking wet, and I can help, that's all." For a long moment, she just stared at him, as if trying to determine whether he was genuine or if this was some kind of trick. Finally, she nodded slowly and stood up, clutching the blanket around her shoulders. She was shorter than he expected, and when she moved, he noticed she limped slightly, favoring her left leg. They walked in silence through the rain, Daniel keeping a respectful distance beside her. When they reached the diner, a small 24-hour place with cracked vinyl booths and fluorescent lighting, he held the door open and she stepped inside. The warmth hit them immediately. A tired waitress looked up from behind the counter, her expression shifting from boredom to suspicion when she saw the homeless girl, then confusion when she noticed Daniel in his expensive suit. But she said nothing, just grabbed 2 menus and gestured toward a booth near the back. Daniel let the girl slide in first, then sat across from her. She kept the blanket wrapped around herself like armor. The waitress came over, and Daniel ordered coffee for both of them, then looked at the girl. "Order whatever you want. Seriously." She studied the menu for a long time, her finger tracing the laminated surface as if she were memorizing every option. Finally, she said, "Pancakes, and eggs, and bacon, and toast." She paused, then added, almost defiantly, "and orange juice." The waitress scribbled it down and walked away. Daniel ordered the same thing, though he wasn't hungry. When the waitress left, an awkward silence settled over the table. The girl avoided his eyes, staring instead at the salt and pepper shakers. Daniel cleared his throat. "I'm Daniel." She glanced up. "Emma." It was the first time she'd given him anything personal, and he felt oddly grateful for it. "How long have you been on the streets, Emma?" Her jaw tightened. "Why does it matter?" "It doesn't," Daniel said quickly. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to pry." She softened slightly. 3 years, since I was 19. Daniel tried to imagine what that meant. 3 years of sleeping in doorways and under bridges. 3 years of cold and hunger and danger. He couldn't. His problems suddenly felt absurdly trivial. "What happened, if you don't mind me asking?" Emma was quiet for a moment, then shrugged. "My mom died when I was 17. Cancer. We didn't have insurance, so the bills piled up. I tried to keep working, tried to pay for everything, but I couldn't. Lost the apartment, lost everything." She said it matter-of-factly, as if reciting someone else's story. "Bounced around for a while, stayed with friends until they couldn't help anymore. Eventually ended up here." Daniel felt something crack inside his chest. While he'd been complaining about trust funds and arranged introductions to executives, she'd been fighting just to survive. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it. Emma looked at him directly for the first time. "You don't have to be sorry. You didn't do anything." The food arrived, and Emma ate with controlled urgency, as if forcing herself not to devour everything at once. Daniel picked at his pancakes, watching her. There was something magnetic about her, something that had nothing to do with appearance and everything to do with presence. She had survived things that would have destroyed him, and yet here she was, still fighting, still holding on to her dignity. When she finished eating, she leaned back and met his gaze. "Thank you," she said simply. Daniel nodded. "Can I ask you something? Where are you staying tonight?" "Same place you found me. It's dry enough when it's not raining this hard." He frowned. "You can't sleep on those steps in this weather. You'll get sick." Emma gave him a tired smile. "I've survived worse." Daniel made a decision then, one that felt both reckless and inevitable. "Come with me. I can get you a hotel room for the night, somewhere warm and safe." Her eyes narrowed. "And what do you want in return?" "Nothing," Daniel said firmly. "I swear. Just a place to sleep, that's all." Emma studied him for a long time, then finally nodded. Okay. They left the diner, and Daniel hailed a cab. He took her to a modest hotel, nothing fancy, and paid for a week in advance. The clerk gave him a strange look, but processed the payment without comment. Daniel handed Emma the key card. The room is yours. No strings attached. If you need anything, my number is on this card. He scribbled his phone number on the back of a business card and handed it to her. Emma took it, looking down at the card with an expression Daniel couldn't quite read. Why are you doing this? Daniel thought about it. Because I can, and because you deserve better than sleeping on the street. She looked up at him, and for the first time, he saw something other than wariness in her eyes. Maybe it was gratitude, or maybe just surprise that someone had seen her as human. Thank you, she whispered. Daniel left the hotel feeling lighter than he had in years. He went back to the penthouse, where the party had finally wound down. His father was waiting for him in the study, a glass of scotch in hand, and displeasure etched into every line of his face. "Where the hell have you been?" Richard Blackwood demanded. "Out," Daniel said simply. "Out?" his father repeated, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You have responsibilities, Daniel. Important people were here tonight, people who could open doors for you." Daniel met his father's gaze steadily. "Maybe I don't want those doors opened." Richard's expression darkened. "Don't be ridiculous. Everything I've built is for you. This empire, this legacy, it's all yours. You can't just walk away from it." "I'm not walking away," Daniel said quietly. "I just need to figure out who I am outside of all this." His father shook his head. "You're a Blackwood. That's who you are. And the sooner you accept that, the better." Daniel didn't argue. He went to his room, changed out of his wet clothes, and lay in bed staring at the ceiling. He thought about Emma, about her strength and her vulnerability, about the way she looked at him like he was just another person, not a name or a bank account. He fell asleep thinking about her eyes. The next morning, Daniel woke early and went for a run through Central Park. When he got back, he showered, dressed, and then, almost without thinking, found himself walking toward the hotel where he'd left Emma. He told himself he just wanted to check on her, make sure she was okay, but deep down, he knew it was more than that. He wanted to see her again. He knocked on her door and waited. After a moment, it opened, and Emma stood there, looking cleaner and more rested than she had the night before. She'd showered, and her hair was damp but neatly combed. She wore the same clothes, but they looked fresher somehow. "Daniel," she said, surprised, "what are you doing here?" "I wanted to make sure you were okay," he said. "Can I come in?" She hesitated, then stepped aside. The room was small but clean, and Emma had made the bed with military precision. Daniel sat in the chair by the window, and Emma perched on the edge of the bed, her hands folded in her lap. "How did you sleep?" Daniel asked. "Better than I have in 3 years," Emma admitted. "Thank you, really." Daniel smiled. "I'm glad." He paused, then said, "What are you going to do now?" Emma shrugged. "I don't know. I've got a week here, so I guess I'll figure something out." Daniel leaned forward. "What if I could help you? Not just with a place to stay, but with getting back on your feet. A job, maybe. A fresh start." Emma looked at him warily. "Why would you do that?" "Because everyone deserves a chance," Daniel said, "and because I want to." Emma was silent for a long moment, her eyes searching his face as if trying to find the catch, the hidden motive. Finally, she spoke. "I don't want charity. I've been on my own for 3 years. I know how to survive." "I'm not offering charity," Daniel said. "I'm offering friendship, and maybe an opportunity. That's all." Emma considered this, then slowly nodded. "Okay, but I pay my own way. Whatever help you give me, I earn it." Daniel respected that. Over the next few days, He made some calls and managed to connect Emma with a friend who owned a small, independent bookstore in Brooklyn. The owner, a woman named Margaret, who had known Daniel since he was a child, agreed to give Emma a chance. The pay wasn't much, barely above minimum wage, but it was honest work, and Emma threw herself into it with an intensity that impressed everyone who met her. Daniel found himself stopping by the bookstore more and more often. At first, he told himself he was just checking in, making sure Emma was settling in okay. But the truth was, he looked forward to seeing her. There was something refreshing about her honesty, her lack of pretense. In a world where everyone wanted something from him, Emma asked for nothing. She treated him like a regular person, teasing him when he recommended pretentious books, rolling her eyes at his ignorance of practical matters like doing laundry or cooking without a personal chef. One afternoon, about 2 weeks after Emma started working at the bookstore, Daniel arrived to find her sitting on the floor in the children's section, surrounded by a group of kids from the neighborhood. She was reading to them, doing different voices for each character, and the children were completely entranced. Daniel stood in the doorway watching, and something shifted in his chest. He saw Emma not as the homeless girl he'd found on the street, but as the person she truly was, kind, intelligent, and full of life despite everything she'd been through. When the reading session ended and the children left with their parents, Emma looked up and saw Daniel. She smiled, and it was like the sun coming out from behind clouds. "How long have you been standing there?" "Long enough," Daniel said, walking over. "You're really good with kids." Emma's expression turned wistful. "I wanted to be a teacher once, before everything fell apart." "You still could be," Daniel said. "It's not too late." Emma shook her head. "I don't even have a high school diploma. I dropped out when my mom got sick, needed to work full-time. College feels like a fantasy." "What if it wasn't?" Daniel asked. "What if I helped you get your GED, then apply to community college? You could study education, become the teacher you wanted to be." Emma looked at him with a mixture of hope and fear. "Daniel, I can't ask you to do that." "You're not asking. I'm offering." He sat down beside her on the floor. "Look, I have more money than I know what to do with. My trust fund alone could probably fund a small country. Let me use it for something that actually matters. Let me help you build the life you deserve." Emma's eyes filled with tears. "Why do you care so much?" Daniel took her hand. "Because when I'm with you, I feel like I matter. Not because of my name or my money, but because of who I am. You make me want to be better. You make me want to do something meaningful with my life, instead of just coasting on my father's success." Emma squeezed his hand. "You already are doing something meaningful. You saved me, Daniel. You gave me hope when I had none left." They sat there in the quiet bookstore, surrounded by shelves of stories about other people's lives, and both of them realized that their own story was just beginning. Over the following months, Daniel and Emma's friendship deepened into something more. Daniel helped Emma study for her GED, sitting with her in coffee shops and libraries, quizzing her on math and history. When she passed the test, they celebrated with cheap pizza and soda, and Emma cried happy tears for the first time in years. She applied to community college and was accepted with a partial scholarship. Daniel quietly covered the rest of her tuition, though he knew better than to tell her that. Emma moved out of the hotel and into a small studio apartment in a safe neighborhood. She insisted on paying the rent herself with her bookstore salary, and Daniel didn't argue, though he made sure the landlord knew to call him if Emma ever fell behind. He respected her need for independence, understood that after years of having no control over her life, she needed to feel like she was standing on her own 2 feet. They spent more and more time together. Daniel would pick her up after her classes or her shifts at the bookstore, and they would walk through the city, talking about everything and nothing. Emma told him about her childhood, about the mother who had worked 2 jobs to keep a roof over their heads, about the dreams they'd shared before cancer stole it all away. Daniel told her about the suffocating pressure of being a Blackwood, about the loneliness of growing up with everything money could buy, but nothing his heart truly wanted. One evening, as they sat on a bench in Central Park watching the sunset over the skyline, Emma turned to him and said, "Can I ask you something?" "Anything," Daniel replied. "Do you ever regret it? Meeting me, I mean. Your father is furious with you, I know that. And I hear the way your friends talk about you now, like you've lost your mind. Do you ever wish you'd just walked past me that night?" Daniel looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the vulnerability beneath the question. "Not for a single second," he said. "Emma, before I met you, I was sleepwalking through my life. I had everything and felt nothing. You woke me up. You showed me what actually matters. How could I ever regret that?" Emma's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "I'm falling in love with you, Daniel, and that terrifies me because I have nothing to offer you. No money, no status, just me." Daniel cupped her face in his hands. "You're everything I've been looking for my entire life. I'm falling in love with you too, Emma. I think I have been since the moment I saw you on those steps." He kissed her then, soft and tender, and Emma kissed him back with a desperation that spoke of years of loneliness and longing. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were crying, but they were happy tears, the kind that come from finally finding home in another person. But love, as powerful as it is, doesn't exist in a vacuum. Daniel's father had been watching his son's increasing distance from the family business with growing alarm. Richard Blackwood was a man who controlled everything in his world, and he couldn't understand or accept that his son was choosing a different path. He had his suspicions about why Daniel was so distracted, but he needed proof, so he hired a private investigator. When the report landed on his desk 2 weeks later, Richard's fury was nuclear. Photographs of Daniel and Emma together, holding hands, kissing in the park. A full background check on Emma, detailing her homelessness, her poverty, her complete lack of social standing. To Richard, it was a nightmare. His son, the heir to the Blackwood empire, was in love with a homeless nobody. It was unacceptable. He called Daniel into his office at the Blackwood building, the towering skyscraper in Midtown that housed the headquarters of Blackwood Enterprises. Daniel knew something was wrong the moment he walked in. His father stood by the window, rigid with anger, a folder clutched in his hand. "Sit down," Richard said, his voice cold. Daniel remained standing. "What's this about?" Richard threw the folder onto the desk. Photographs spilled out. Daniel's stomach dropped. "You had me followed? I needed to know why my son was throwing away his future," Richard said. "And now I understand. You're in love with a homeless girl."
"Have you lost your mind?" Daniel's jaw clenched. "Her name is Emma, and yes, I love her." Richard laughed, a harsh sound without humor. "Love. Daniel, you're 24 years old. You're supposed to be learning how to run this company, making connections, building your reputation. Instead, you're wasting your time with some street rat who probably sees you as a meal ticket." "Don't you dare talk about her that way," Daniel said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Emma is the most genuine, kind, hardworking person I've ever met. She doesn't want my money. She's never asked me for anything." "Of course she hasn't," Richard scoffed. "That's how con artists work. They make you think it's your idea to help them." "Daniel, I've seen this 1,000 times in business. People who come from nothing will do anything to get a piece of what we have." "You don't know her," Daniel said. "You don't know anything about her." "I know enough," Richard replied. He picked up the folder. "I know she's been homeless for 3 years. I know she has no education, no prospects, no family. I know that she's a liability, a PR nightmare waiting to happen. Can you imagine what the board would say if they found out? What our investors would think?" "I don't care what they think," Daniel said. Richard's expression hardened. "Then you're a fool. Daniel, I'm giving you a choice. End this relationship with this girl, focus on your responsibilities, and take your rightful place in this company. Or continue down this path and lose everything. Your trust fund, your position in the company, your place in this family. I'll cut you off completely." Daniel stared at his father, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time in his life. Richard Blackwood wasn't just a successful businessman. He was a man who had traded his humanity for success, who measured worth in dollars and judged people by their bank statements. Daniel had been raised to become the same kind of man, but Emma had shown him there was another way to live. "Then cut me off," Daniel said, quietly. Richard's face went pale. "What did you say? You heard me. If that's the price of being true to myself, of loving someone who actually makes me happy, then I'll pay it. I don't want your money or your empire if it means giving up Emma." "You're making the biggest mistake of your life," Richard said, his voice shaking with rage and something else, something that might have been fear. Fear of losing his son. "No," Daniel said. "The biggest mistake of my life would be becoming you. I'm done, Dad. I'm done living by your rules, caring what society thinks, measuring my worth by the size of my bank account. Emma taught me that there's more to life than wealth and status. She taught me what real strength looks like, what real courage is, and I'm not giving that up for anything." He turned and walked toward the door. Richard called after him, "If you walk out that door, you're no longer my son." Daniel paused, his hand on the doorknob. Without turning around, he said, "Then I guess I'm not your son." He left the building and went straight to Emma's apartment. When she opened the door and saw his face, she immediately pulled him inside. What happened? Daniel told her everything. About the private investigator, the photographs, his father's ultimatum, his choice. Emma listened with growing horror, and when he finished, she was crying. "You can't do this," she said. "Daniel, you can't throw away your entire life for me. Your family, your future, everything you've ever known. I'm not worth that." Daniel took her face in his hands. "You're worth everything. Emma, before you, I was just existing. I had money, sure, but I was empty inside. You filled that emptiness. You showed me what it means to live with purpose, to care about something more than profit margins and stock prices. I don't want my father's empire. I want a life that matters, and that life is with you." Emma sobbed against his chest. "What are we going to do?" "We're going to be okay," Daniel said, though he wasn't entirely sure how. "I'll get a job, a real job, not one handed to me because of my name. We'll figure it out together." And they did, though it wasn't easy. Daniel moved into Emma's tiny studio apartment. It was a far cry from the penthouse he'd grown up in, but it felt more like home than any mansion ever had. He found work at a nonprofit organization that helped at-risk youth, using his business degree to help them secure funding and manage their operations. The pay was a fraction of what he would have made at Blackwood Enterprises, but the work felt meaningful in a way that reviewing quarterly reports never had. Emma continued her studies and her job at the bookstore. Money was tight, tighter than Daniel had ever experienced, but they made it work. They learned to budget, to shop for groceries, to appreciate simple pleasures like cooking dinner together or walking through the park instead of going to expensive restaurants. Daniel discovered that he didn't miss the luxury. What he'd really been missing all along was connection, purpose, love. The media had a field day with the story. The billionaire's son who gave up his fortune for a homeless girl became tabloid fodder for weeks. Some outlets painted it as the greatest love story of the generation. Others were crueler, suggesting Emma was a gold digger or that Daniel was having some kind of mental breakdown. Daniel and Emma learned to ignore it, to focus on building their life together rather than worrying about public perception. Daniel's former friends abandoned him, unable to understand why he would choose love over wealth. But he didn't mourn those relationships. They had never been real friendships, just convenient connections based on social standing. The people who mattered, like Margaret from the bookstore and Daniel's colleagues at the nonprofit, supported them completely. As months turned into a year, then two, Daniel and Emma built something beautiful together. Emma graduated from community college with honors and was accepted into a teaching program at a state university. Daniel was promoted at the nonprofit and was now running programs that helped homeless youth get off the streets, a cause that had become deeply personal to both of them. They got engaged on the anniversary of the night they met, a simple proposal with a modest ring that Emma treasured more than any diamond. They were planning a small wedding, just close friends and the people who had supported them, when Daniel received an unexpected phone call. It was from a lawyer he didn't recognize, informing him that his father had died of a massive heart attack. Daniel felt a complicated mix of grief and numbness. He hadn't spoken to Richard in over 2 years, and now he never would. There would be no reconciliation, no chance for his father to meet Emma properly, to see what Daniel had built, to understand why he'd made the choice he did. The funeral was a massive affair, attended by business leaders and politicians and society elite. Daniel stood apart from it all, Emma beside him, holding his hand. After the service, the lawyer approached him with a manila envelope. "Your father wanted you to have this. It's to be opened only by you, in private." Daniel took the envelope home, and that evening, sitting on the small couch in their apartment with Emma beside him, he opened it. Inside was a letter in his father's handwriting, and as Daniel read it, tears began streaming down his face. The letter read, "Daniel, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and I can't say these things to your face, which is probably for the best because I was never good at apologies. You were right, and I was wrong. I spent my whole life building an empire, accumulating wealth and power, and I thought that was what mattered. I thought that was what would make you happy, what would make me happy. But in pushing you to follow my path, I lost the only thing that truly mattered. I lost my son. These past 2 years without you have been the loneliest of my life, and they made me realize something I should have understood long ago. Love is the only thing that lasts. Empires fall, fortunes disappear, but love endures. I see that now, though it's too late to tell you in person. I watched you from afar, Daniel. I had someone keep tabs on you, not to control you, but because I needed to know you were okay. And what I saw amazed me. I saw you building a life that matters, doing work that helps people, loving someone with your whole heart. You became the man I always hoped you'd be, just not in the way I expected. I never changed my will, Daniel. Despite everything, despite disowning you publicly, I couldn't bring myself to actually cut you out. So you're still my heir. Everything I built is yours. But here's what I want you to know. I'm not leaving it to you because I expect you to become me. I'm leaving it to you because you're better than me. You'll know what to do with it, how to use it in ways I never could. Build something beautiful, son. Build something that matters. And please, tell that girl of yours, Emma, that I'm sorry. Sorry for the things I said. Sorry for not seeing her worth. Sorry for trying to keep you apart. Love her well, Daniel. Love her the way I failed to love your mother, the way I failed to love you. Forgive me if you can. If you can't, I understand. But know that in the end, The only thing I'm proud of is you. Not the businessman you might have become, but the man you chose to be. That's my real legacy. You are my real legacy. I love you, son. I always did, even when I was too stubborn and foolish to show it. Build something better than I did. I know you will.
Dad. Daniel wept, and Emma held him as he grieved for his father and for all the time they'd lost. But through the grief, there was also a strange sense of peace. His father had understood in the end. He'd seen what Daniel had tried to show him all along, that there are things more valuable than money, that love and purpose and connection matter more than empires. The inheritance was staggering, billions of dollars in assets, properties, investments. Daniel could have simply lived off the interest and never worked another day in his life. But that wasn't who he was anymore, and Emma supported whatever he decided to do. They talked for weeks about what to do with the money, and finally, they came to a decision that felt right. Daniel established the Emma Blackwood Foundation, named after the woman who had changed his life and taught him what really mattered. The foundation's mission was comprehensive, helping homeless youth get off the streets by providing not just temporary shelter, but comprehensive support, including education, job training, mental health services, and long-term housing. It was everything Daniel wished had been available for Emma when she was struggling, everything he'd learned from his own work in the nonprofit sector. Emma became directly involved in the foundation, eventually finishing her teaching degree and running an educational program for homeless and at-risk youth. She understood what these kids were going through in a way that no one else could, and they responded to her authenticity and compassion. The foundation grew rapidly, opening centers in cities across the country, helping thousands of young people build better lives. Daniel still went to work every day, not because he had to, but because it gave his life meaning. He and Emma remained in their modest apartment for another year before finally buying a small house in a quiet neighborhood. Nothing ostentatious, just a comfortable home where they could build a life. They got married in a simple ceremony, surrounded by the people who mattered. Margaret from the bookstore, colleagues from the foundation, kids whose lives they'd helped change, and a few genuine friends they'd made along the way. Years passed, and their story became legendary. Not because it was fairy tale perfect, but because it was real. The billionaire's son who walked away from everything for love, and the homeless girl who saved him from a life of emptiness. Their foundation helped tens of thousands of young people escape homelessness and poverty. Their marriage, built on mutual respect and genuine love, became a model for what partnership could be when ego and materialism were stripped away. When Daniel and Emma's first child was born, a daughter they named Grace, Daniel held her in the small nursery of their home and marveled at how much his life had changed. He thought about the man he might have become if he'd never met Emma, if he'd stayed on the path his father had laid out for him. He would have been wealthy, powerful, and utterly hollow. Instead, he was a husband, a father, and someone who made a real difference in the world. He had everything that truly mattered. Emma found him there, standing by the window with their sleeping daughter in his arms, and wrapped her arms around him. "What are you thinking about?" she asked softly. "I'm thinking about that rainy night," Daniel said. "The night I met you on those cafe steps. I'm thinking about how one decision, one moment of actually seeing another person changed everything. I'm thinking about how lucky I am." Emma kissed his cheek. "We're both lucky. You gave me a chance when no one else would. You saw me when I was invisible to everyone else. You saved me, Daniel." Daniel shook his head. "No, we saved each other. You showed me how to live, how to love, how to be human. everything good in my life started with you." They stood there together in the quiet nursery, their daughter sleeping peacefully, and both of them understood a truth that the world often forgets. Wealth measured in dollars is fleeting and ultimately meaningless. Real wealth is measured in love, in purpose, in the lives you touch and the differences you make. It's measured in courage, in choosing what matters over what's easy, in seeing the worth in every human being, regardless of their circumstances. Daniel's story and Emma's story became intertwined into something bigger than either of them alone. It became a testament to the transformative power of love, not the romantic fantasy version, but the real kind that sees clearly and chooses deliberately, the kind that requires sacrifice and courage, the kind that changes not just individual lives, but ripples outward, creating waves of hope and possibility. People still talked about them decades later. The Blackwood Foundation had grown into one of the most effective organizations fighting youth homelessness in the country. Emma had written books about her experiences and her approach to education for at-risk youth, inspiring a generation of teachers and social workers. Daniel had proven that wealth could be a force for genuine good when wielded by someone who understood its limitations and responsibilities. Their children grew up understanding that they were privileged, but also that privilege came with responsibility. They learned from their mother's stories about survival and resilience, and from their father's choice to value love over wealth. They learned that every person has worth, that circumstances don't define character, and that the greatest legacy anyone can leave is a life lived with integrity and compassion. And through it all, Daniel never forgot that rainy night, never took for granted the gift he'd been given when he stopped to help a homeless girl on a cafe doorstep. Emma never forgot the young man in the expensive suit who looked at her and saw not a problem to be solved or a charity case, but a human being deserving of dignity and care. Their love story wasn't perfect. It was better than perfect. It was real. And it was proof that sometimes the most unexpected encounters lead to the most extraordinary transformations. In the end, what left everyone speechless wasn't just the romance of their story, though that was compelling enough. What truly amazed people was the way their love multiplied, touching thousands of lives, creating opportunities where none had existed, offering hope to those who had lost it. They proved that one person's choice to see another person's humanity can change everything. That love isn't just a feeling, but an action, a decision, a commitment to choose someone else's well-being alongside your own, even when the cost is high. Daniel often spoke at fundraising events for the foundation, and he always told the same story. He would describe that rainy night, the moment he saw Emma on those steps, the decision to stop rather than walk past. And then he would say, "I didn't save Emma that night. She saved me. I was drowning in a life that looked perfect from the outside, but felt empty on the inside. Emma showed me what it means to be truly alive, to care about something more than quarterly earnings and social status. She gave me purpose." Emma, for her part, would speak at schools and community centers, sharing her story with young people who were facing their own struggles. She never sugarcoated the harsh realities of homelessness, the fear and the cold and the constant uncertainty. But she also talked about resilience, about the importance of accepting help when it's offered, about the power of education and determination. And she always ended with the same message. Your circumstances don't define you. I was homeless, but I wasn't worthless. I had lost everything, but I hadn't lost myself. And when someone finally saw me, really saw me, everything changed. You are seen. You matter. Don't ever forget that. The Foundation's flagship program was called Second Chapters, a name Emma had chosen. It provided comprehensive support for homeless youth aged 16 to 25, offering emergency shelter, but also so much more. There were educational programs to help kids get their GEDs and apply to college, job training workshops that taught practical skills, mental health counseling to address the trauma that so often accompanies homelessness, life skills classes covering everything from budgeting to cooking to interviewing for jobs. And perhaps most importantly, a network of mentors, adults who committed to walking alongside these young people as they rebuilt their lives. Daniel had insisted on one particular feature of every second chapter center, a library. Not just a few shelves of donated books, but a real library with comfortable chairs, good lighting, and thousands of books across every genre. Emma had cried when she saw the first one, remembering her own love of reading, how books had been her escape during the hardest times. Everyone deserves a place where they can dream, she'd said, running her fingers along the spines of the books. Everyone deserves to imagine different possibilities for their lives. The success stories were countless. There was Marcus, who had been living in his car after aging out of foster care, who went through the Second Chapters program and was now a registered nurse. There was Sophia, who had been trafficked as a teenager and escaped with nothing, who now ran her own nonprofit helping other survivors. There was James, who had struggled with addiction and homelessness for 3 years, who got sober through the program's support and was now working as a counselor, helping others fight the same battles he'd won. Each of these young people had their stories displayed in the Foundation's annual report, not as statistics or success metrics, but as human beings whose lives mattered.
Daniel and Emma made it a point to stay connected with many of them, attending graduations and weddings, celebrating victories, and offering support during setbacks. They understood that transformation wasn't a straight line, that people needed ongoing support and community, not just a one-time intervention. As Daniel and Emma's children grew older, they became involved in the Foundation's work too. Their daughter Grace, who was now 15, volunteered at the local Second Chapter Center, tutoring younger kids in math and reading. Their son Thomas, 13, had started a fundraising campaign at his school, organizing donation drives and educational events to raise awareness about youth homelessness. Their youngest, 8-year-old Lily, insisted on making care packages for the center, filling bags with socks and granola bars and handwritten notes that said, "You matter," in her careful child's handwriting. Daniel's relationship with the broader Blackwood family had remained complicated. Some of his relatives had eventually reached out, curious about the Foundation's work, intrigued by the positive press it generated. A few had even become donors and supporters, though Daniel suspected their motivations were as much about the social cachet of philanthropy as genuine compassion. He accepted their help regardless, knowing that the money would do good work no matter why it was given. His relationship with his father's memory had evolved too. In the years after Richard's death, Daniel had worked through his anger and hurt with the help of a therapist Emma had encouraged him to see. He came to understand that his father had been shaped by his own upbringing, his own era, his own fears and insecurities. Richard Blackwood had genuinely believed that wealth and power were the measures of success, had genuinely thought he was preparing his son for the best possible life. He'd been wrong, but he hadn't been malicious. And in the end, he'd recognized his mistakes. That letter, written when he knew death was approaching, had been his way of releasing Daniel from the burden of his expectations, of giving his blessing to the life his son had chosen. Daniel kept that letter in a safe in his study, and sometimes, on difficult days, he would take it out and read it again. It reminded him why the work mattered, why he'd made the choices he had, why love and purpose were worth any sacrifice. Emma had her own rituals for staying grounded.
Once a month, she would spend a night volunteering at a homeless shelter, serving meals and talking with the residents. She never forgot where she'd come from,
Never let success distance her from the reality of what homelessness meant. The other volunteers, who knew her story, marveled at her humility and her continued commitment. But for Emma, it wasn't about being humble or impressive. It was about remembering, about staying connected to the part of her journey that had shaped who she was. One evening, after one of these volunteer shifts, Emma came home to find Daniel waiting up for her with hot tea and a warm blanket. She settled onto the couch beside him, exhausted but content. "There was a girl there tonight," Emma said softly. "Couldn't have been more than 19. She reminded me so much of myself at that age. Scared, trying to act tough, but you could see the fear in her eyes." Daniel wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "Did you talk to her?" Emma nodded. "I gave her information about second chapters, told her my story. I don't know if she'll follow up, but at least she knows there's an option, that someone cares." She leaned her head against Daniel's shoulder. "It's been almost 20 years since that night you found me, and I still remember exactly how it felt. The cold, the fear, the feeling that I was invisible to everyone passing by. And then you stopped. You saw me." Daniel kissed the top of her head. "Best decision I ever made." "We've helped a lot of people," Emma continued. "Thousands of kids have gone through our programs. But there are still so many more out there. Still so many people sleeping on the streets tonight. Sometimes I wonder if we're making enough of a difference." "We can't save everyone," Daniel said gently. "But we've saved some, and those some have gone on to help others. That 19-year-old girl you talked to tonight, if she comes to second chapters, if we help her get back on her feet, who knows how many lives she'll touch, how many people she'll help. Our impact ripples outward, Emma. We can't measure it all, but it's there." Emma smiled. "When did you get so wise?" "I learned from the best," Daniel replied, squeezing her hand. The foundation continued to grow. They opened centers in 30 cities across the country, each one tailored to the specific needs of its community. They partnered with local organizations, with schools, with businesses willing to provide job training and employment opportunities. They lobbied for policy changes at the state and federal level, pushing for increased funding for affordable housing, for better mental health services, for education programs that served vulnerable populations. Daniel testified before Congress multiple times, using his platform and his family name, the very things he'd once rejected, as tools to advocate for change. It was ironic in a way. The Blackwood name that had once felt like a prison now opened doors that allowed him to help others. He'd learned to use his privilege strategically, never forgetting that it was privilege, never taking it for granted, but also not refusing to leverage it when doing so could make a difference. Emma completed her doctorate in education, focusing her dissertation on trauma-informed teaching practices for students experiencing homelessness. Her research was published in academic journals and cited by educators across the country. She became a sought-after speaker and consultant, but she always made time for the classroom, teaching part-time at the Second Chapters Center nearest their home. Those hours with students, seeing their growth and celebrating their achievements, remained the most rewarding part of her work. On the 20th anniversary of the night they met, Daniel and Emma returned to that cafe where he'd first seen her. It was under different ownership now, renovated and upscale, barely recognizable from the shabby place it had been. But the steps were still there, and they sat on them together as the sun set, holding hands and remembering. "If someone had told me that night," Emma said, "that 20 years later I'd be sitting here with my husband, that we'd have 3 beautiful children, that we'd have helped thousands of young people build better lives, I never would have believed them. I thought my life was over. I thought I'd die on the streets." "If someone had told me," Daniel countered,
that the sad, empty guy walking away from a party would find everything he was looking for on these steps, I wouldn't have believed them either. I thought happiness was something I'd never find, or maybe something I didn't deserve. Emma turned to look at him. Do you ever regret it, walking away from the easy path? Daniel shook his head firmly. Not once. Not for a single second. This life, our life, it's been hard sometimes. We've struggled, we've faced criticism, we've had to fight for everything we've built. But it's real, Emma. It matters. And I wake up every morning, grateful for it. Grateful for you. I love you, Emma said simply. I love you too, Daniel replied. Always have, always will. They sat there as the city lights began to twinkle on around them. Two people whose unlikely meeting had sparked something extraordinary. Their story had inspired books and articles, even a documentary. But for Daniel and Emma, it wasn't about being inspiring or exceptional. It was about making a choice, again and again, to see the humanity in others, to act with compassion, to use whatever resources they had to make the world a little better. The foundation established an annual award called the Second Chapter's Hero Award, given to individuals who had overcome homelessness and gone on to make significant contributions to their communities. The award ceremony became a major event, drawing attention to the issue of youth homelessness and celebrating the resilience of those who'd survived it. Each year's recipient received a grant to support their continued work or education, but more importantly, they received recognition, a public acknowledgement that their journey mattered, that their survival was an achievement, that their future contributions were valuable. One year's recipient was a young man named David who had lived on the streets for 4 years after being kicked out by his family for being gay. Second Chapters had given him shelter, support, and community. He'd gone on to become a social worker, and he now ran a program specifically for LGBTQ youth experiencing homelessness. At the award ceremony, he gave a speech that moved the entire room to tears. I want to thank Emma and Daniel Blackwood, David said, his voice strong despite the emotion in his eyes. Not just for creating this foundation, but for showing all of us that our worth isn't determined by our circumstances. Emma could have let homelessness define her forever. Daniel could have chosen comfort and wealth over integrity and love. But they both chose differently. They chose to see beyond the surface, to believe in possibility, to act with courage. And because of those choices, hundreds of people like me have been given a second chance at life. We've been given the message that we matter, that we're worth investing in, that our futures are bright. That's the real gift, not just the shelter or the education or the job training, as important as those things are. The real gift is being seen, being valued, being told that you deserve good things. So thank you, from the bottom of my heart, for seeing us. Emma couldn't hold back her tears as David spoke. Daniel held her hand tightly, both of them overwhelmed by the reminder of why they did this work, why it all mattered. After the ceremony, they spent time talking with David and the other award recipients, listening to their stories, celebrating their achievements. These were the moments that sustained them, that made every challenge worthwhile. As Daniel and Emma entered their 50s, they began thinking about succession planning for the foundation. They wanted to ensure that the organization would continue long after they were gone, that it wouldn't be dependent on their personal involvement. They built a strong board of directors, recruited talented staff, established endowments to ensure financial stability. They mentored younger leaders within the organization, preparing them to take on increasing responsibility. But even as they planned for the future, they remained deeply involved in the day-to-day work. Emma still taught her classes, still mentored students, still spent her monthly night at the shelter.
Daniel still oversaw the foundation's strategic direction, still testified before legislative bodies, still personally visited every new second chapter center that opened. They couldn't imagine doing anything else. This work wasn't just what they did, it was who they were. Their love story, which had started with such drama and opposition, had settled into something deeper and more enduring. They'd been through hard times together, financial stress in those early years, the death of Emma's former bookstore mentor Margaret, health scares and parenting challenges, and all the normal struggles of life. But they'd faced everything together, their bond strengthening with each challenge overcome. They'd built a partnership based on mutual respect, shared values, and a commitment to something bigger than themselves. On their 25th wedding anniversary, their children threw them a surprise party. The guest list was eclectic, a mix of foundation staff and board members, former Second Chapter's residents who'd stayed in touch, neighbors and friends from their modest middle-class neighborhood, and even a few members of Daniel's extended family who'd eventually come around. There were no celebrities or billionaires, no ostentatious displays of wealth. Just a backyard full of people whose lives had been touched by Daniel and Emma's love for each other and their commitment to helping others. Grace, now 25 herself and working as a teacher in a low-income school district, gave a toast. "My parents taught me that love isn't just a feeling, it's a verb. It's something you do every single day, in big ways and small. They showed me that by loving each other, yes, but also by loving people they'd never met, people society told them didn't matter. They taught me that everyone has worth, that circumstances don't define character, that privilege comes with responsibility. Mom, Dad, thank you for showing me what it means to live with purpose and integrity. Thank you for being the best example I could ever ask for." Thomas, who was now working for the Foundation's Policy and Advocacy Division, added his own words. "I grew up hearing the story of how my parents met, and I've always been amazed by Dad's courage in walking away from his inheritance, and by both of my parents' determination to build something meaningful together. But what impresses me most isn't the grand gesture, it's the thousand small choices they've made every day since then. The choice to live modestly when they could afford luxury. The choice to spend their time helping others instead of pursuing leisure. The choice to teach us kids that our responsibility is to leave the world better than we found it. That's the real love story, the everyday choice to keep choosing each other and choosing what matters." Even young Lily, now 18 and headed to college in the fall, shared her thoughts. "My friends think it's cool that my parents are kind of famous, that there are articles written about them and everything, but to me, they're just mom and dad. They're the people who helped me with my homework and drove me to soccer practice and made sure I understood that I was lucky to have opportunities that not everyone gets. They never let me forget that with privilege comes responsibility. And they showed me every single day what love looks like in action. I'm so proud to be their daughter." Daniel and Emma stood together, surrounded by the people they loved and the life they'd built, and felt overwhelmed with gratitude. This, Daniel thought, was what wealth really looked like. Not penthouses and private jets, but a backyard full of people who genuinely cared about each other. Not a bank account with endless zeros, but a life filled with purpose and meaning. Not social status and power, but the knowledge that you'd made a difference, that you'd helped people, that you'd chosen love over fear. Emma looked at her husband, seeing the gray in his hair now, the lines around his eyes from years of smiling and working and caring. He was still handsome to her, but more than that, he was good. He was kind. He was the man who'd seen her on those cafe steps and chosen to stop, chosen to help, chosen to love. And that choice had changed everything. Not just for her, not just for him,
but for thousands of people whose lives had been touched by what they'd built together. "What are you thinking?" Daniel asked softly, noticing her gaze. Emma smiled. "I'm thinking about how one rainy night changed the entire trajectory of both our lives. I'm thinking about how lucky we are. I'm thinking about how love really does conquer all, not in some fairy tale way, but in the real, hard, beautiful way we've lived it." Daniel pulled her close. "Best rainy night of my life." "Mine too," Emma agreed. The foundation continued its work for decades more. Long after Daniel and Emma stepped back from day-to-day operations, the organization they'd built kept growing, kept evolving, kept helping young people find their way off the streets and into stable, hopeful futures. The second chapter's model was replicated by other organizations across the country and even internationally. The ripple effects of that one rainy night, that one decision to stop and help, spread farther than either Daniel or Emma could ever fully comprehend. When Daniel and Emma were in their 70s, a filmmaker approached them about making a documentary about their lives and the foundation's work. They were hesitant at first, uncomfortable with attention being focused on them personally. But the filmmaker convinced them that their story could inspire others, could show people what was possible when you chose love and purpose over comfort and convention. So they agreed, on the condition that the film would focus primarily on the young people helped by second chapters, not on them. The resulting documentary was called Seen. It premiered at a major film festival and went on to win multiple awards. But more importantly, it sparked a national conversation about homelessness, about privilege and responsibility, about what really matters in life. The film showed Emma teaching her classes, her patience and compassion evident in every interaction with her students. It showed Daniel testifying before Congress, his passion and knowledge compelling even skeptical lawmakers to listen. But mostly, it showed the faces of the young people whose lives had been changed, their stories of struggle and survival and ultimately triumph. One sequence in particular moved audiences to tears. It showed Emma returning to the cafe steps where Daniel had found her all those years ago. She sat there alone for a moment, remembering, and then Daniel joined her, just as he had that rainy night. They sat together in comfortable silence, holding hands, and the camera simply watched them. No narration, no music, just two people who had chosen each other, and in doing so, had changed the world in their own small but significant way. In the final scene of the documentary, Emma spoke directly to the camera. "If there's one thing I want people to take away from our story," she said, "it's this. Every person you pass on the street has a story, has worth, has potential. When Daniel stopped that night, he didn't know who I was or who I might become. He just saw another human being who needed help, and he chose to act. That's all any of us need to do. See each other, really see each other, and then do what we can to help. It doesn't have to be dramatic or life-changing. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is just stop and acknowledge someone's existence, their worth, tell them they matter, because they do. Everyone does." Daniel added his own final thoughts. "I walked away from billions of dollars, and I've never regretted it for a moment, because I gained something far more valuable. A life that matters, a love that sustains me, a purpose that gives every day meaning. If you're watching this and you're feeling empty despite having everything society says you should want, I promise you there's another way. Choose love, choose purpose, choose to see the people others overlook. Your life will be richer for it in ways money could never accomplish." The documentary became a cultural phenomenon. Schools used it in their curricula. Churches and community organizations screened it and held discussions. It inspired a new generation of young people to pursue careers in social work, education, and nonprofit management. Donations to second chapters and similar organizations skyrocketed. But perhaps most importantly, it changed the conversation around homelessness, humanizing an issue that too often was reduced to statistics and stereotypes. Daniel and Emma lived to see their great-grandchildren, passing on their values and their story to another generation. They never moved back into luxury, never pursued wealth for its own sake, never regretted the choice they'd made on that rainy night so many years ago. They'd proven that love wasn't just a feeling or a fairy tale, but a force powerful enough to transform lives, to change systems, to ripple outward in ways that touched thousands upon thousands of people. When Emma passed away at the age of 82, surrounded by her family, her last words to Daniel were simple: "Thank you for seeing me." Daniel, holding her hand, replied through his tears, "Thank you for teaching me how to see." He lived 3 more years after Emma's death, years spent ensuring the foundation's continued success, years spent sharing their story with anyone who would listen, years spent missing his wife but grateful for every moment they'd shared. When he died peacefully in his sleep at 85, the outpouring of grief and gratitude was immense. Thousands of people whose lives had been touched by Daniel and Emma attended memorial services held in cities across the country. The foundation they'd built continued strong, helping its 100,000th young person escape homelessness in the year following Daniel's death. Their children and grandchildren remained involved, carrying on the legacy, ensuring that the love story that had started on those cafe steps would continue to bear fruit for generations to come. And in the end, what left everyone speechless wasn't just the romance, though that remained compelling even decades later. What truly amazed people was the proof that one choice, one moment of seeing another person's humanity, could spark a chain reaction of goodness that spread farther than anyone could imagine. Daniel and Emma had shown the world that love, measured not in grand gestures, but in daily choices, not in what you have, but in what you give, is the only thing that truly lasts, the only wealth worth accumulating, the only legacy worth leaving behind. Their story became a reminder that sometimes the richest people are those who have given away the most, that the most successful lives are those lived in service to others, and that the greatest love stories are those that inspire not just the lovers themselves, but everyone whose lives they touch. Daniel had been born into wealth and chose to walk away from it. Emma had been born into poverty and fought her way out of it. Together, they built something far more valuable than any inheritance, a life that mattered, a love that endured, and a legacy that would continue to change lives long after they were gone.